Let's go ahead and get started on our discussion of the 2022 national midterm and Michigan state elections for this year. And I want to begin by going over a few general thoughts. For many of you, you know we're doing a series right now through the question of Christian citizenship. What does it mean to be a citizen of heaven, primarily, as Scripture says, and a citizen of an earthly kingdom nation? How do we balance those things out? What does that mean? But these are some things that are a little broader even than that message. So I want to talk about some of those questions. And the first one is this. It's one that we maybe haven't thought through, but we ought to, and that is, are Christians required to vote? Are Christians required to vote? Now, this is a good question, right? Because I see some of you nodding your head yes, maybe a few of you shaking your head no. What do we do? Well, let's put it another way. Let's ask this question in a little bit of a different format. Is it a sin for a Christian not to vote? That's the other way to put this. Now this starts getting real, we're not sure what we want to say, right? So let's think this through. First of all, context matters. In some nations, citizens are given the right to vote. The United States is a great example of a nation where the citizens are given the right to vote. Now, certainly there are some exceptions to that. For instance, in some states, felons are not allowed to vote. They've lost their franchise. We don't let everybody vote, right? My son is 17 years old. He does not get to vote this year. He's got to wait a little while. Now, he, I think, desperately wants to vote. He has ideas. Some of them are even good. But he's got a lot of ideas, and he wants to share them, right? Just like every other 17-year-old boy. But we certainly have those situations. So in our nation, citizens are allowed to vote. Did you know that there are some nations around the world that require citizens to vote? Mandatory, compulsory voting. In fact, Australia is an example of a nation that has compulsory voting, and they enforce it. If you are an eligible voter and you do not vote, the first offense is a $20 fine, and they do assess it. They keep track of who votes and who doesn't, and it can go up to $180 if you are a habitual non-voter. And what do you know? They have turnout rates of about 96%. It's amazing what happens when you force people to do it. I'm not advocating that, please don't hear me say that, but there are several nations around the world that do have compulsory voting. Some nations don't allow voting. Saudi Arabia, for instance, you don't vote for the king of Saudi Arabia. That's not an elected office. And then there's some nations who hold elections, but let's all be honest, they're shams. Cuba, North Korea. Maybe you remember back in the 90s, Iraq used to be so proud of the fact that Saddam Hussein got 95% of the vote in that nation. Now, the 5% who voted against him were killed, but that's irrelevant, right? He got 95% of the vote. It was a sham election. It wasn't it. So context matters, right? Is a Christian in Saudi Arabia in sin because he or she did not vote in an election that didn't exist? Right? We have to think these things through. The context matters. I think that in nations where citizens are given the right to vote, like the U.S., it is a high privilege and duty to cast your vote. I think that that's a right that was provided to us by those who've served in the military to provide us with these ongoing protections. I'm very thankful for that. I would not go so far as to say it's a sin not to vote, but I would say that it is a civic duty, and it's one that you should exercise. It's very important because obviously the direction of the country goes based on who holds elected office. We've seen that over and over and over, and we'll look at that in more detail tonight. So ultimately, though, it's a matter of conscience, because there are times when you look at the candidates and you say, ooh, have you ever had that feeling in the ballot? Yeah. Yeah, I hope I expressed that eloquently to you, that feeling that you sometimes get. I know I've had it. And there have been elections where I did not vote for the candidate of either party. Major party. I still cast a vote because in the U.S. we have third parties. And so that becomes another question, right? Is that throwing your vote away if you've voted for the Libertarian or the U.S. Taxpayer Party or whatever the case may be? And I would argue strongly it is not throwing away your vote if you cast a vote. If you cast it according to your conscience, that's never throwing away a vote. Never. And so ultimately, I think you should vote, but if you come to a ballot, an election on the ballot where you can't vote for either of the major candidates, maybe you don't vote at all or you vote for a third party, I think you're fine as long as that's what your conscience has led you to do, okay? So that's the first question. Second, this one gets a little bit more tricky. Must Christians only vote for one specific party? Have you heard this one before, right? And listen, I get it because I hear this a lot. How in the world could a Christian vote for somebody from X party? I don't want to say any names. You can probably guess. I don't think anybody here is stupid. We've heard that often, right? And when you think about our current climate, there's a lot of people who hold to this. Now, within our context here at Faith Baptist Church, I bet there's one particular party that people are thinking of when it comes to this question. But if I took you to a church in inner city Detroit, you would hear this same question, but it would not be filled out the same way. It would have another party there. And so these are also brothers and sisters in Christ who are coming to this conclusion. Is it something that they can do? When we start evaluating these things, it's a question of prioritization. And it's prioritization of the policy positions of that party and where they rank in your hierarchy. So for many of us, one of the defining issues that we have when we evaluate a party or a candidate is the question of life, right? Where does that candidate stand on the question of life, particularly unborn life? Would they consider themselves pro-life or pro-choice? And so we would then prioritize that, and we would say, well, I could never vote for a pro-choice candidate because that does not align with values that I hold at the very top. Okay? Other people have other priorities that they put up there. Even other Christians, believe it or not, it does happen. For some, it's matters of justice. For some, it's matters of economics. And for some, it's matters of thinking about how the government should be involved in everyday life. So these questions are there, and how we prioritize them will often lead us to where we fall on that question regarding the parties. Now, are there exceptions to this rule? Yeah, I come from the South. Most of you know that. When I was growing up, I voted for a lot of Democrats and a lot of Republicans because a Southern Democrat at a local level was not the same as a national Democrat. The local Democrats were often very much like Republicans. And if any of you have been in the South and things like that, you know that that was the case. They were pro-life. They were economically conservative. They maybe favored a little more government intervention in the economy and things like that. But you could get around that and go with the other aspects. So your location might play a role. But even today, there are pro-choice Republicans, and that's actually becoming more of a thing. There's also more Republicans who are bucking against the party in questions of marriage and family relationships. So those are things that are causing us to rethink our electoral matrix, if you will, how we fit things in there. Okay, so then the last question that I have is, does the advance of God's kingdom hinge on an election outcome? This one's probably the easiest question to answer. No. God's kingdom advances no matter who is in office. Daniel 2:21. Remember, we know that verse well, where Daniel is standing before King Nebuchadnezzar, and he says, "It is God who changes seasons, and it is God who raises up kings and takes down kings. God who raises nations and takes down nations. He is the one who is in control of history." Psalm 146, verses 3 and 4, that's the one that says, "Put not your trust in princes." Because guess what happens with princes? The author of that psalm says, they die, they turn to dust, and so do their plans. And their plans turn to dust as soon as they do. That's how long they last. So if your hope for the safety of the church, the advancement of Christianity, or anything like that is in a political party or a political leader, you've put it in the wrong place. God's kingdom advances. Remember what Jesus told Peter in Matthew 16? He said that he was establishing the church. Jesus was establishing the church. And when he established the church, guess what? Not even the gates of hell will prevail against it. Now, often we think about that verse as hell advancing against the kingdom or something like that. It's not quite what gates do. Gates don't advance anywhere. Gates are designed to keep people out, right? Satan has control of this world for a season, and the kingdom has invaded at the first advent of Christ, and it is advancing, and it is advancing against the gates of hell. And guess what? The gates of hell will not prevail. The kingdom of God will prevail. The advance of the kingdom will not be stopped. It cannot be stopped. And that makes sense, doesn't it? We don't believe in dualism. We don't believe that there's a good God and a bad devil, and man, it's yin-yang. It's pretty evenly divided. We don't know what's going to happen. Maybe it's like that picture you've seen online of Jesus and Satan arm wrestling. That's a terrible picture, because that ain't going to happen, right? Jesus doesn't arm wrestle with Satan. He breaks Satan's arm. It's not even close, right? That's not what's happening. No, God is all powerful. Satan is not, okay? So, yes, let's be aware of the elections. Let's participate as long as we have the right to participate. Let's influence government as much as we can while we have the right to do so. But at the end of the day, who is in control? It is God. He has all authority, and he has the plan. Now, I don't know about y'all, but I have read the end of the book. I've seen how it ends. Maybe you have too. And it's a good thing. It's a good thing, okay? But guess what? Along the way, it does get rough. It does get rough. So we're going to run into those kind of issues. And sometimes that happens in our elections. So let's shift our attention. Does anybody have any questions about any of that before we go on? That was all pretty straightforward, I thought. So very good. Okay. So national election outlook. Let's talk about this for just a moment. The first thing I want to do is talk about the party platforms. Now, I gave you a handout. Looks like this. It says My Faith Votes Party Platforms at the very top. This compares the three main parties. Really, there's two main parties and a third that sometimes wins at the local level, the Libertarian Party. But it compares those three parties' platforms on different issues. This is not the entire platform of both parties, but it is on the major issues. And I want to highlight just a couple of these for you this evening as we move through them, okay? First of all, the very first one, life and abortion at the top. The Democratic Party's platform: we will appoint U.S. Supreme Court justices and federal judges who will respect and enforce foundational precedents, including Roe v. Wade. Now, I'm going to stop right there. This is the party platform adopted in 2023 or 2020 before the election. The major parties adopt their platforms in presidential election years. And so this is going to carry through 2023 into 2024 at the next election, at which time when they gather together in their national convention, they'll adopt a new platform. And it just outlines what the party stands for and what kind of policies they're going to pursue. So Roe v. Wade is not precedent anymore, but what they say is they're going to appoint Supreme Court justices and federal judges who support Roe v. Wade. Democrats believe every woman should be able to have access to high-quality reproductive health care services, including safe and legal abortion. We oppose and will fight to overturn federal and state laws that create barriers to women's reproductive health and rights. Now, there's some of the things in there that, words matter. Words matter. Reproductive health care rights. Abortion is not health care. And I say that with full understanding of what I'm saying. And I'm not including things like ectopic pregnancy. Sometimes people will say, oh, you don't think that, if a lady is about to die because of an ectopic pregnancy that you won't let her have a life-saving abortion. Well, first of all, I don't really consider that an abortion in the first place, except in the medical sense of the term. But no, that's not part of this, and no abortion laws that prevent abortions block that. Don't listen to the nonsense on that. But one of the things that strikes me about this, maybe you are old enough to remember that the Democratic platform used to describe abortion with 3 words. Does anybody remember what those 3 words were? Safe, legal, and rare. There's no more rare included in the Democratic platform. Rare, honestly, was never the goal. So you have that. I'm really not going to focus on the Libertarians tonight. If you want to read their platform, feel free. We're just going to look at the 2 main ones. The Republican platform on this matter says, foremost among those, the Constitution's guarantee that no one can be deprived of life, liberty, or property deliberately echoes the Declaration of Independence proclamation that all are endowed by their Creator with inalienable right to life. Accordingly, we will assert the sanctity of human life and affirm that the unborn child has a fundamental right to life which cannot be infringed. We support a human life amendment to the Constitution and legislation to make clear that the 14th Amendment's protections apply to children before birth. So this is a strong stance on this question. And you've certainly seen this come up numerous times, certainly with the Dodd decision that recently came down that overturned Roe v. Wade. That was because of the Republican Party's platform and commitment to appoint justices to the federal judiciary, including the Supreme Court, that would eventually overturn what was bad law in the first place. Just like the Dred Scott decision was bad law. Separate but equal was wrong the day it was decided, and so was Roe. Roe was wrong the day it was decided, and that's what Justice Alito wrote in his opinion. And that's absolutely correct. So we see stark difference between the Democratic and Republican parties. It used to be said that there wasn't a dime's worth of difference between the Republicans and Democrats. And yes, many years ago, if you were to look in the mid-20th century at the two parties' platforms, they were pretty similar. They diverged on a few things, but they shared a lot in common. There is no sharing in common between the two parties on this. There's no common ground. Let's look at marriage and sexuality. That's the next one here. The Democratic platform. Democrats applaud this year's Supreme Court decision that made clear that employment discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity violates the law, but we know we still have work to do to ensure LGBTQ plus people are treated equally under the law and in our society. We will fight to enact the Equality Act and at last outlaw discrimination against LGBTQ plus people in housing, public accommodations, access to credit, education, jury service, and federal programs. We will work to ensure LGBTQ plus people are not discriminated against when seeking to adopt or foster children, protect LGBTQ plus children from bullying and assault, and guarantee transgender students access to facilities based on their gender identity. Democrats will ban harmful conversion therapy practices. We will ensure that all transgender and non-binary people can procure official government identification documents that accurately reflect their gender identity. One thing that strikes me about this part of the platform here is that this would have made no sense to somebody in 1950. I mean, honestly, these words would have been just alphabet soup to them. They would not have known what to make of this other than whoever wrote it was insane. And I think that we are at a point now, we have seen within our culture, within our society, the revolution in morality has accelerated with breakneck speed. If you had asked anybody in 2010 if same-sex marriage would have been legalized in the U.S., they would have said, no, it's not going. And then what happened in 2015? Obergefell. And now we're in 2022. We're just 7 years later. And the T part of that LGBTQ+, the T, transgenderism, is reshaping even that, right? Because now it's calling into question what is a man, what is a woman, in sports, high schools, elementary schools, and we're going to see eventually with one of the propositions in Michigan, it affects even this. It's not just about abortion. It's about so much more. The Republican Party side, foremost among those institutions is the American family. It is the foundation of civil society, and the cornerstone of the family is natural marriage, the union of one man and one woman. We oppose the imposition of a social and cultural revolution upon the American people by wrongly redefining sex discrimination, reshaping our entire society to fit the mold of an ideology alien to America's history and traditions. I'm just going to tell you, watch this in particular on the Republican Party side in 2024 at the Republican convention. And I say that because many of you know that here recently there was a bill that came up in the House of Representatives on the question of homosexuality, homosexual marriage, and things like that, wanting to codify same-sex marriage beyond just the Obergefell decision. I believe it was 54 Republicans voted in favor of that. What's that? Yeah, it was. It might have been 46, 50. It was around 50, somewhere around 50 Republicans in the U.S. House voted in favor of that. And the reason they did so is because they have been pressured into thinking that they need to be on, quote unquote, the right side of history. We know what that means. It means get with whatever the social program is right now, or else we'll cast you out as bigots and intolerant, and you'll be cast into the outer darkness where there's much wailing and gnashing of teeth. So, but that's where it is, right? We need to be aware of this. We need to hold our elected representatives faithful on this. If they support changing the party platform on those questions, then we've got a big issue there too. Absolutely. I'm not saying Christians need to be Republicans, but at least at this point there's one party that holds to it, because the Libertarian Party does not. The Libertarian Party has been advocating for same-sex marriage since its inception. So bear that in mind. Scott had a question, so Andy, you get to run over there with the mic.
So the question I've got is, since we're with the...
Hold the mic up farther. Yep.
All right. With the Republican Party being currently right now the more traditional thing, that if they start pushing, is it okay or good for us as Christians, United Christians, being able to promote a conservative party that's actual conservative, or should we still just kind of like flow through the parties as they go, consciously, individually, looking at the people rather than choosing a party?
I think that comes back to the question of conscience within each person. I mean, the people have the right always to form their own parties as they see fit, right of association in the First Amendment. And so I would absolutely encourage that, and I think you would see a fracturing of the Republican Party if that continues to go through. I think you will see the Republican Party splinter. Parties have done that in the past in American history, and I think that it will happen again in that regard. And you would have one that continues to hold to a more traditional belief system, and eventually the segment that is moving more to center left would merge into the left party. Okay? And then you'd have two parties again. And the reason for that, this is a little inside baseball for everybody tonight. There is a political science concept called Duverger's Law. Duverger's Law says that in a first past the post election system, meaning whoever gets the most votes, not necessarily a plurality or, it's a plurality. So whoever gets the plurality of votes wins. In that kind of setting, it's going to lead to a two-party system, and it always does. It's the closest thing that political science has to a law, theoretical law. So, but anyway, that's just a little bit of side note. So that's what will happen, is that one part will merge into the other one will become the traditional party, the more conservative party, and you'll see a realignment in the culture on that. All right, let's go to the third page of that, religious freedom. And you'll see there's other ones on here like immigration, racism, healthcare. Read over those. They're very, very important, but there's just a couple more I want us to look at tonight. Religious freedom. Democrats celebrate America's history of religious pluralism and tolerance and recognize the countless acts of service of our faith communities, as well as the paramount importance of maintaining the separation between church and state enshrined in our Constitution. So, first of all, there is no separation of church and state enshrined in our Constitution. We know that comes from a letter from Thomas Jefferson to the Danbury Baptist Association in Connecticut in 1801, I believe. But that's the Democratic position. The Republican position: we value the right of America's religious leaders to preach and Americans to speak freely according to their faith. Republicans believe the federal government, specifically the IRS, is constitutionally prohibited from policing or censoring speech based on religious convictions or beliefs. We pledge to defend the religious beliefs and rights of conscience of all Americans and to safeguard religious institutions against government control. We strongly support the freedom of Americans to act in accordance with their religious beliefs, not only in their houses of worship, but also in their everyday lives. That's a huge distinction, especially that last sentence, because what we've heard so often, especially from those who are on the left, is that you are free to believe whatever you want as long as you do it within your house of worship or your home, but nowhere else. You can't live out your faith in public, in the public square, because you're imposing, you're somehow breaking down this wall of separation between church and state by telling people that Jesus loves them or pointing them to God through Jesus Christ. That's just not okay. And as we've seen, we have a right to influence the government, and the government does not have a right to influence the church. Caesar must never enter the pulpit. That is a foundational principle of American government. And I would argue it's right in Scripture that the government should never come in and tell the church what it should preach, how it should preach, or anything else. Perhaps some of you remember a few years ago, the city of Houston, the mayor of Houston, actually subpoenaed pastors in that city asking for transcripts of the sermons that they were preaching in their churches, because some pastors were speaking out against a city ordinance that was proposing, I think it was transgender, removing gender bathrooms, letting people just go in where men into women's into men, all that kind of stuff. And they subpoenaed the pastors on that. Now, I got to tell you, as a pastor, I'm torn on that, because there's part of me that says, no, you can't do that, and that's right. But two, there's part of me that's like, yes, please read my sermon. Not because I think I'm such a great preacher, but it's the gospel. All I do here is give the gospel. That's all I got. So yes, read it, would you? In fact, I'll come and read it to you if you'd like. I'd invite you to come here anytime. You're welcome. So that's an issue. Religious freedom is under attack. Religious liberty is under attack in our country, and we need to be aware of that. Now listen, at the end of the day, if our religious liberty from our nation is taken away from us, I'm still a Christian. I'm still going to worship. I'm still going to gather, no matter what. I hope that's where you are. I hope that is where your heart is, that no matter what it costs, we do not deny Christ. We do not turn from him. We may go underground, but we do not turn from him. We will proclaim him. We will confess him always. Okay, the last one to show you here, education, at the bottom of that same page. As Democrats, we believe that education is a critical public good, not a commodity, and that it is the government's responsibility to ensure that every child everywhere is able to receive a world-class education that enables them to lead meaningful lives no matter their race, zip code, disability status, sexual orientation, gender identity, or household income. And then the Republican side, parents are a child's first and foremost educators and have primary responsibility for the education of their children. Parents have a right to direct their children's education, care, and upbringing. We support a constitutional amendment to protect that right from interference by states, the federal government, or international bodies such as the United Nations. We reject a one-size-fits-all approach to education and support a broad range of choices for parents and children at the state and local levels. So you can see the difference there. One, very much a state-controlled, state-dictated educational system. One, a parental-decided system with diversity in that. Sunday morning, it was not in my notes, but I couldn't help but to make that observation that if there was a silver lining to the pandemic and the closing of the public schools, or it's that the education continued via Zoom, and parents got to actually listen to what their kids were being taught, and they actually got to see what that material was, and parents were shocked. And they started showing up at school board meetings. I actually read a study yesterday on the difference between people's privately held convictions and their publicly stated convictions. Maybe you saw this, maybe you didn't. I would encourage you to look it up. It was fascinating. One of them was on education, and it talked about different demographic groups: younger people, millennials, Gen Y, that's Gen Y, Gen Z, all of that. And what they would say publicly, including how they answered polls, was often a huge distance from what they actually believed. I studied survey research pretty extensively in my PhD work. I could have told you that. We've known that for a long time. This isn't a surprise, because people have a tendency to do a couple of things. One, they want to be socially accepted, and so they'll say what they think is socially acceptable. That's a natural thing. Two, we have a natural tendency, believe it or not, most of us want to do what the authority figure asks us to do. And so, we can talk about the Milgram experiment. That was a terrible understanding of that. But in surveys, the survey taker is seen as an authority, and people will answer survey questions according to what they think the survey taker wants them to say, whether it's what they believe or not. So that's why we see polls so different, and we see election results that come out so different from the polls, because people are saying, oh, well, I know you want me to say I'm supporting this candidate, but really when I go in there and it's just me and my ballot, I ain't voting for him or her. I'm voting for the other person. So this is what's happening, and the gap is huge, especially on education. And a tremendous number of people privately believe, I think it was pushing somewhere between 60 and 70%, were saying, we think that this idea of institutionalized racism and gender identity being taught in the schools has gone way overboard. It's too much. And so that's some pretty incredible findings. Yes, Deb, hold on, Andy.
So does this mean they are wanting to get rid of charter schools, religious teaching schools, that kind of thing, when the Democrats are talking about they want the government to do all this control instead?
That's a good question. I will answer this as kindly and tactfully as I can. I think that the Democratic Party is okay with those as long as they subscribe to all federal education regulations. If they deviate from that and teach something else, they're not okay with that. If that's religious instruction or in charter schools, we've got a lot of charter schools around here. I officiate some high school and middle school sports. There's a charter academy over in Marshall Academy. And I was pleasantly surprised the first time I officiated an event there, and the AD came out and prayed before the match, and not just a generic prayer. This was a Lord Jesus prayer. I was very surprised and very thankful. And that's a public school. It's a charter school, but it's a public school. So yes, I would say that there would be concerns from one side and not so much from the other. Okay. Yes, Jason.
One thing I would add to that, I respect the things that,
Make him run. It's okay.
someone else have, raise your hand over there next. No, I think I would add one thing to that from the Democratic Party in public education, there's a very strong tie to teachers' unions.
Mm-hmm.
And the Democratic Party is a very strong supporter of unions, and there's a tie there that I think also from the educational standpoint, which might be important to think about when it comes to charter and private schools. There's not teachers' unions in those institutions, which in general, Democratic Party would not look favorably upon those for those reasons as well.
Sure. And I think that it's important to remember, too, I'm not trying to be anti-union or anything like that, but I think it's good to be honest. The National Education Association is on record saying our focus, what we advocate for, is not the students. We don't care about education per se, we care about the teachers. That's our constituency, that's who we advocate on behalf of. We should expect that it's a teachers union, that's what a teachers union should do, but we ought to be at least aware of it and go from there, right or wrong. It's what it is. Okay, so that gives you just an indication that there's some differences here between Democrats and Republicans. We should know that. We should be aware of it, and we should be familiar with the platforms. They're easy to read. You can go through them on your own. But let's jump into the elections here in Michigan on a national level. First of all, we have no senators up for re-election. If you know anything about the U.S. Senate, 1/3 of the Senate is up for re-election every 2 years. And that was designed such in the U.S. Constitution. It's designed to be elected 1/3 of the constituency of the Senate every 2 years. And the reason that it's only 1/3 of the Senate was to provide consistency over time. The Senate's the upper chamber, and it was designed to be the cooling chamber where the passions of the people's house would go and slow down. That was the idea. It's not necessarily how it happens now, but that's also why the Senate was not elected by the people at the writing of the Constitution. The states chose their own senators because the senators were supposed to represent the states, not the people. And there you had representation of the people in the House and the states in the Senate. With the passage of the 16th Amendment, I believe, you had popular vote for senators, and now you have both chambers representing the people, just in larger or smaller constituencies. And that's changed a little bit. But just so you know, Debbie Stabenow, who is the senior senator from Michigan, she is up for re-election in 2024, and Gary Peters, the junior senator, is up for re-election in 2026. So just be aware of that. Both are Democrats, and both have been pretty secure in their re-election bids. Stabenow has been serving, I think, for close to 20 years, somewhere around 20 years now as a senator. And Gary Peters, less than that. I can't remember exactly when, but he replaced Carl Levin when he was a long-term senator here in Michigan as well. And I have a little bit of a connection to Carl, Senator Levin, through Aaron's dad, who got in a verbal altercation with him in his office one time. So anyway, now you know where Aaron gets it. All right, let's talk about this. The Senate outlook, the U.S. Senate outlook. You've probably heard a lot about this. The balance of the Senate right now is 50-50. There's 50 Republican senators, 50 Democratic senators, and that means the Democrats have control. You go, wait a minute, I thought it was even. It's because the president of the Senate is the vice president of the United States, who is Kamala Harris, who is a Democrat. So she, in the case of a tie vote in the Senate, she casts the deciding vote, which includes for who controls the Senate, who's the Senate majority leader. So the Democratic Party has effective control with 51-50, okay? So that's where we're at. What's coming up? Why is this such an important thing? Well, one of the big issues is the question of the filibuster. Okay, so what's the filibuster? I know this seems like, wow, I'm in a U.S. civics class. What's going on here? The filibuster is a technique in the Senate. It essentially means extended debate. The filibuster is not what it used to be. How many of you have ever seen Mr. Smith Goes to Washington? Okay, so you know what the filibuster is. Jimmy Stewart standing there in the well of the Senate and talking and talking and talking. Yes, that is a filibuster. There have been some spectacular filibusters over the years, and often for some terrible pieces of legislation or to prevent legislation. For instance, the longest filibuster on record is held by a man by the name of Strom Thurmond. Strom was a senator from South Carolina. He served there from the time of Thomas Jefferson. I say that because he was old. He celebrated his 100th birthday in the Senate, at his birthday party he said, "I love all you men, but I love you women more." He was not a good guy. But he ran as a Dixiecrat for president in the 1940s. Yes, he was a third-party candidate, segregation now, segregation forever kind of person. But Strom Thurmond filibustered the civil rights legislation, the Civil Rights Act, when it first came up. He stood on the floor of the Senate and talked for over 24 hours. And you might say, how in the world did he do that? I mean, pastor only goes 45 minutes. How did he do 24 hours? So, I mean, but yes, it can be. There were, the rule is he can't leave the floor. He can't step away. He can't say, time out, I need to use the restroom. Time out, I'm hungry. No time outs. So how did he do it? One, he ate crackers. And he didn't drink any water. But still, he did have to step away, and apparently one of his fellow Democrats at the time stood up to ask him a question and went on and on and on with the question and allowed him to step off into the cloakroom and relieve himself and then come back to the floor. And so at the end, the filibusters, the whole point is that if you don't want something to be decided, you just talk and talk and talk. And it doesn't matter what you say. He read from the phone book. He read recipes from constituents that they had mailed to him. He did all kinds of stuff, as long as nobody can stop him from voting unless cloture is reached. Cloture means we vote to end debate. And right now in the Senate, it requires 60 votes to end debate. Well, it's 50-50, right? So really, unless it's a huge bipartisan deal, you're not going to get cloture. And so now all it takes is just the threat of a filibuster. Nobody actually gets up and talks. They just say, if you bring this to the floor, I'll filibuster it. And they say, okay, fine, we're not going to bring it to the floor. And it doesn't move forward. So does this create gridlock? Does this slow down the process? Yes. And it's designed to. That's the point. The founders did not want legislation to just get rammed through Congress. They understood that there were dangers in that. And so they allowed the Senate to make its own rules, and this was one of the rules of the Senate. It actually used to be 2/3 of the Senate had to vote for cloture. But the Senate changed its rules. It has the power to do that under the Constitution, and lowered it from 67 votes to 60 votes. That's what they did, okay? But the filibuster is important because it does stop dangerous legislation from going through. It's very, very important. And people who want to see the end of the filibuster are incredibly short-sighted. I don't mean that as an insult, but you're looking at the right now and the fact that you can't get this one thing through that you really want to get through. It's not supposed to be, we're not a parliamentary system. In a parliamentary system, whichever party has control gets everything it wants all the time. Because they have the majority and they win every vote. We're not designed to be that way. We have checks and balances. We have means of counteracting one another. This is one of those things. It's brilliant on the part of the founders that we have this. If it goes away, we're going to see huge swings back and forth depending upon who has control of legislation. And we're just going to be doing this all the time. Okay? So that's one thing. The second thing about the Senate that's important is judicial and executive appointments. The Senate advises and consents with the executive over the appointment of federal judges, including Supreme Court justices, and all executive cabinet positions and several others, okay? Which means that if the Senate does not consent, that person does not take that position. That's important. And so who controls the Senate has influence over who the president puts into those positions. It is, again, a way of tempering the system and tempering the extremes. That's important. It should be there. And then finally, there's a lot of talk right now of codifying Roe v. Wade at the national level. And what I mean by that is putting it into U.S. law, federal law. If the Senate is controlled by the Democrats in full, they have pledged they will get rid of the filibuster and push through this codification of Roe. We need to just be aware of that. Max has a question.
Can that be done, codifying Roe by executive order?
No. They cannot codify Roe by executive order. Executive orders are only to clarify laws that already exist, and they're written to clarify how those laws will be executed. That's the purpose of an executive order. And that's what I'll say about that.
Well, that's great. That's good.
That's what it's supposed to be. It's not what it has been lately. Shelby? Lisa, did I see your hand up too? Oh, okay.
If I'm not mistaken, the judicial and executive appointments only need a majority. They cannot be filibustered.
Not now. They used to be.
Yes.
But that has changed, yes. So it does only require a majority with the exception of Supreme Court justices. Supreme Court justices, no, there's one of them that can still be filibustered. And you caught me and I can't think of what it is now. It may be the federal justices or judges can still be filibustered, but the justices cannot.
The Democrats removed the filibuster for below the Supreme Court, and then the Republicans came in and removed it just before Trump for
Yeah.
Supreme Court justices.
Yeah, yeah. But there's still one level that is exempt, that the filibuster still applies to, but I can't remember right now what it is. Isaac, and then we're going to keep rolling here.
Okay, this is just a question, sorry to make
Yeah,
you
no,
too
that's
serious.
fine.
What is stopping the powers that be from instituting enough judges to overcome the decisions that have been made by this particular court? What is stopping them from voting enough judges in, stuffing the court?
Oh, okay, so the court packing. Okay, so the idea of court packing comes from the sense that the U.S. Constitution does not stipulate how many justices serve on the Supreme Court. Congress sets that number. And that number has changed over the history of the United States. It has not always been 9. It has been 7, it's been 8, it's now 9. It's been 9 for a long time. 9's a good number, okay? Go back to the 1930s and Franklin Delano Roosevelt with the New Deal. He's wanting to institute a whole lot of new government programs to combat the Great Depression and everything like that, and he keeps running into roadblocks at the Supreme Court. And all of the old justices who were more in the conservative line of thinking were blocking and ruling everything that he tried to do unconstitutional. So Roosevelt said, okay, that's fine, you can do that. Then I'll just go to Congress and have them put enough more justices on the court to give me the majority. It was a blatantly political move, and it did not sit well with the public. But it scared the Supreme Court enough, because they knew he could do it, that a couple of the justices switched their votes, and now the New Deal started to become ruled constitutional. It's called the switch in time that saved 9. So that's where that court packing idea comes from. Now it's been brought forward again because of the Roe v. Wade decision, that they want to redo the number of justices on the court and put through enough who are more activist judges than originalist judges, and get enough votes on there to bring it back around. What's stopping them? Public opinion, really. Because even if right now the polls are showing that abortion rights, people favor abortion rights and they favor Roe, they don't favor packing the court. They don't want to see the court they already think it's too politicized, and they don't want to see it become more politicized. That's the challenge there. So yeah, that's what's stopping them, public opinion at this point, but that's about all. Max?
Real quick, excuse-wise, they wanted to make D.C. Answer was they wanted to make D.C. a state and Puerto Rico a state, if I'm saying this correctly, to get more delegates, right?
Well, that
It's
would
like a court pack?
that wouldn't do anything for the court. It would do it for the Senate, because
Sorry, what was it?
it wouldn't change the composition of the court, but it would change the composition of the Senate. Because if D.C. was a state and Puerto Rico was a state, then both would receive 2 senators per the Constitution. That would be 4 additional senators in the Senate, and those are both very strong Democratic locales.
You're right, I remember that now.
Yep, no, that's no big deal there. Okay, so, yeah, I was hoping to get through the House. We're not going to get through the House tonight, but that's why I gave 2 weeks for this. And we're going to come back next week and go through the House and get into Michigan local elections next week, okay? But the point of all of this is to remember that it matters how we're involved, right? I said at the outset, if your conscience tells you not to be involved, okay, But if we have the privilege to vote, if we have the right to vote in this nation, let's exercise it, and let's exercise it. I'm not going to ever tell you who to vote for here, because that's not right. I gave you one of the handouts, and we'll close with this. It says Liberty Counsel at the top. Liberty Counsel is one of the excellent groups out there that fights for religious liberty and many other great things. But this is a political and legislative guideline for pastors and churches. And so you'll see different things you could do for supporting or opposing candidates or supporting or opposing legislation, and then 2 columns, church and pastor. What can the church do? What can the pastor do? Pastor as an individual, not as the church. Okay? So for instance, endorsing or opposing political candidates, churches may not do that. Pastors, in their individual capacities, may do that. And you do see pastors in some faith traditions endorsing candidates all the time, right? That's something you see, especially in the African American community. It is very common for their pastors to endorse candidates and even platform them in the church, bring them in on Sunday morning, let them speak, and things like that. And that is legal. I do not think it wise, but it is legal to do. But the church cannot endorse or oppose a political candidate. I will not tell you up here in a sermon or anything else to vote for this candidate or don't vote for that candidate. That is not my role. Now, if you ask me privately what I think, I will be happy to talk about that, but I will not do so in a situation like this because it's not legal. I'm not going to jeopardize the church for something silly, but 2, I don't think it's right for me to do that in this capacity. But if you're just curious about what the do's and don'ts are, this is a really good shorthand for do's and don'ts for churches and pastors, okay? So next week when we come back, we're going to pick up here with the U.S. House, and then we're going to jump into Michigan because after the U.S. House, there's nothing more to talk about nationally, okay? We don't have any senators up for re-election. We do have representatives because representatives are up for election every 2 years. The entire House gets re-elected every 2 years, and there's reason for that too. But anyway, let's go ahead and pray, and then we'll dismiss for the evening. Father, thank you so much for this time that we could spend studying these issues. Father, I pray that as we do so through the lens of the gospel, and that we're reminded that we're given a great privilege here, and that not by accident. You have ordained this nation to exist, and you have ordained it to exist with the laws and the rights and the privileges that we enjoy here. Father, I pray that as Christians we would exercise them in every way to glorify you and to seek to advance your kingdom. But Father, let us never think or start to believe that it's the government that protects your kingdom, or that it's the government that advances your kingdom. Father, help us to remember that it is Jesus Christ who advances his kingdom, and that we stand with him, and that we owe our ultimate allegiance to him as our King. And so, Father, as we go out from this place, I pray that we are encouraged and not discouraged, that even if things don't go the way that we would like them to go in this election, that we would remember that you are sovereign over all, and that at the end of the day, you will be victorious, because you already are victorious. And we praise you for that in the name of Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.